When I was 5, I was actually run over by a huge motorbike. It was actually a Harley Davidson, and it ran me clean over. And at the point of impact, I found myself up high, looking up and down the street, seeing the little boy across the road. We'd been like fighting with each other and pulling faces, and he'd been doing this, and all of a sudden he was kind of like this, because from his perception, I'd been hit by this motorbike, but I didn't feel it because I was actually up out the body and looking around the street. So that was the first experience that I had, and that was quite young.
Sort of out-of-body experience.
It was an
Yeah,
right? I guess, like an out-of-body experience. And of course, as a 5-year-old, that could have been really normal. We don't question that, and then life continues. And then at the age of 15, I was involved in a very serious car crash. The car began to turn and turn. The driver was going much too fast. It began to flip over like this. And ultimately it crashed into a wall, and it was upside down, and it was on fire, and we were all trapped inside, so it was quite frightening. And again, that was the appearance from the outside. Inside for me, as the car started to turn, I had this huge, intense fear, and this thought that, the thought was, I'm going to die, this is it. And all of a sudden that fear melted away, and I was no longer in the car. I'm not quite sure where I was. Importantly, I wasn't quite sure what I was, because I'd expanded, and was feeling myself to be so much more than this child, than this 15-year-old girl, and felt this incredible peace and this incredible love. And there were no lights, and there was kind of nothing fancy there. It was this darkness, but it was very womb-like, like a loving darkness. And then in that moment, I started to have what we would consider as a life review. So I saw every single nuance and moment of my very short life, because I was only 15, and it just flashed. And it felt like forever, but it felt like no time too. So I was okay. The ambulance came, and I wasn't badly injured. Some of the passengers were quite injured, but I was very lucky. The problems arose. So for 2 weeks after that, I was in this state of peace, and people were coming to visit me at home, and I was like loving everybody, even people I really didn't like before. I was just full of love for everybody, and very peaceful. And then 2 weeks I was fine. I had to go back to school, and that's when the issues began for me, because I was still then having these expansive type experiences where I'd feel myself all of a sudden not kind of in the body, and expanding and expanding. And I started to withdraw from people, because, integration after an experience like that can be really challenging. And one of the reasons it's so challenging, as a society, we're not equipped to deal with these kinds of experiences. We don't talk about them. If we are aware of them, we don't do anything about them, or we'll categorise them as, well, it's just disassociation, or it's PTSD, or it's... But it wasn't just that. It was having this knowing about yourself as a 15-year-old child that there is just far more to this, and you can't understand why the world is working the way it is. It doesn't... Nothing seems to feel right in that. So as time progressed, I pushed it all away because I couldn't deal with it, again, because there was nothing to support that. And I guess to cope with my pain and trauma, not just from the accident, I had a very difficult childhood. I'm the daughter of an alcoholic, of a parent with an addiction. So there was lots of trauma there too, and it was trying to navigate that. So to do that, I built myself this big armour through academia and career, because I thought that would just make it all go away, and I don't have to think about or be with what happened, and I can have some kind of life. And I got a career in local government, so I've worked in kind of local government contexts where I managed research. Again, this is where the work comes in. It was all about getting services to recognise the importance of people's living experiences when they are designing things like health or education or whatever the service is. So that's where these two things start to then converge. So I'd built this egoic armour and this career, and this is what I'm going to do. Studied linguistics and thought about, how does language make the world work? What role does discourse play? And for me, I started to think, well, everything's discursive. There's nothing, there's only language, there's only discourse. So I was also a hardcore constructionist at this point too. But I couldn't continue to keep covering what had happened. And then around 10 years ago, I started to kind of enter into this, what we'd call maybe a dark night of the soul, where the cracks started to open and everything started to seep out, and memories of being young and what happened in the accident, and it just wouldn't leave me alone, and I couldn't cover it anymore. And
you had to process it.
It broke.
I broke. Deal with it, yeah.
Well, it was all of a sudden. I will share this bit of the story. It got so bad that I decided I couldn't live with myself anymore, and one day decided I wasn't going to live with myself and wanted to end it all, and planned to take tablets and to have done with all this. And as I was moving towards doing this, something just happened again, where it was almost a repeat of what happened when I was 15, that something pushed through, and again I expanded, and I just expanded, and I felt that love and that peace, and of course that was it. I was okay. And then from that moment, me as a 15-year-old, I pushed it and didn't want it and needed to integrate. And me, as an older woman I need to know what this is. What is this? What is this? I recognise this as me. This is a truer version of me, but I need to know more about this. So I started to explore what that was through listening to people, listening to spiritual teachers, and then finding academics that were actually talking about this, but in a more scientific and academic way. So then I converged linguistics and my research with children with, okay, we're going to explore this now, and that's how the work began.
So Donna, that experience actually led you to do research with children, right? You always emphasize that with children and not on children.
Yeah,
Why do you think it's so important with children?
Yeah, so when children are invited into research, which isn't that often, especially in fields such as the hard sciences or health, and sometimes even in fields such as education, which is very child-centred, children are not often invited into research, and that's because they're viewed as incapable of taking part. They're not really seen as knowers of knowledge. They're always kind of seen as becoming adult rather than a being in their own right. And then often when we do bring children into research, we are researching on them, and we're positioning children as these passive objects or passive subjects, and rather than active agents. And that's the difference. So it's the kind of partners in research. That's the difference between with and on. Mm-hmm.
And kids feel it, I think. I would imagine they feel it, or not?
Absolutely.
Being a subject or being a partner in research, I think that's...
When you make a child a research partner, they come to life. Mm-hmm. That creativity is flowing, their ideas are flowing. I mean, they will tell you things that you've not even considered before you've started the research. And there's lots of ways we do involve children in research, so they can be co-designers. So children can come in right at the beginning of a research project and help you to design that research and think about who might participate in that, help to bring participants in, other children. And you can train children to do qualitative research. And then we do things such as peer research, where, as we're speaking now, you might have two children, with one of them, the researcher, asking another child a question. And again, that's amazing, that dynamic between children and that level of information that can come. So there's all different kinds of ways to involve children in research.
But how, practically speaking, how does your research look like? What do you do, actually, with kids?
real research.
Yeah.
So it depends on the project. So, and there's always a degree of agency for children depending on, and it might be best to give examples rather than to explain a specific. Well, it's qualitative research, so it's the idea that it's epistemological authority of people, so they are knowers of their own, they are experts in their own living experience. And in qualitative research, that's kind of the primary data. Now, in traditional qualitative research, and even that carries this, it's underpinned by this kind of logical empiricism, and because historically qualitative research had to fight to be seen as a proper science, as real research. It had to be seen as rigorous, but the consequence of that is then we have to try and measure human experience, measure the immeasurable, something that, you know, we can't really take those kinds of scientific methodologies and put them onto subjective, living, fluid experiences of human beings. So, you know, as a response to that, this is why these kind of non-traditional research methodologies came around, because it was to challenge that idea of that traditional research. And what that means is that it can be more creative. We can place value on different kinds of knowledges rather than just that one scientific, numerical, statistical. That's one knowledge, but that's knowledge that carries value. But in reality, there are a range of different knowledges, a range of different ways that people represent that knowledge. So for a child, you know, they're not going to write you an essay, or but they may draw a picture, and that's a knowledge, and it's a form of representation. So we use creative methodologies, but we can also use traditional too, and that all depends. So in some of the studies, an example is we have just completed a study, a pilot study that's researching near-death experiences or extrasensory experiences with children aged between, I think it's 6 and 18, in an intensive care unit. So the purpose of this research, again, is that things don't work very well for families in intensive care units, because from their perspective, doctors don't listen to what they want and need. It's very kind of cold, and again, we're back to measuring this, but there's so much more going on in an intensive care unit, especially when a child is near to death. So the way we'd set up that project is that we have to go through very rigorous research ethics that can take 18 months. We have to design a methodology. So we can't do verbal interviews with some of these children. So that's when we bring in methods such as art and play and bring that in so that we can ask questions with children and their parents if they're very young. You know, we have 3 magic questions actually. So some of these children have actually died 2 or 3 times in ICU and have been resuscitated. So we'll ask, you know, what happened before you fell asleep or lost consciousness? What happened when you woke up? And then kind of the killer question, what happened in the middle? Because that's kind of a question that we wouldn't think to ask, because they're unconscious or they've died, or and children report things that have been happening that are very similar, for example, to near-death experiences.
And what was the most interesting case that you came across during your research?
There's so many interesting cases. I think my favourite experiences are these transcendental type experiences, and these are the experiences that I am really, really interested in, simply because they might tell us things about consciousness or self that we might not be able to get from just researching some of the other kinds of experiences, such as telepathy or you know, many children in my study, some of the most reported experiences are things like engaging with beings that other people can't see, and not imaginary friends. These are beings of all different shapes and sizes. So some that apparently look like people, some that look like animals, some that look really strange and that they can't really describe, but they can draw. So they see a whole range of beings that other people can't see. And the other one is out-of-body experiences. That is, we always have a real high incidence of children reporting out-of-body experiences. So the transcendental ones are my favourite, and I think what blows me away is when one that really sticks in my mind again, and maybe because it resonates with me so much, is there was a young girl and she'd had a suicide attempt. Yes, it was very, very sad. And while in hospital and recovering, she had an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She began to look around the ward and look at the other young people and recognise that, you know, their lives might be much more, you know, worse than hers. And then she had this gratitude, and then all of a sudden she talked about expanding and expanding, and, you know, recognising there's so much more and feeling so much love. And what she reported was when she left hospital, she'd actually been on medication for depression for quite a long time. She stopped it immediately and she never went back to it. So for me, that's an example of how some of these experiences might also generate some kind of self-healing or well-being for children. But because we don't research them, because they're seen as woo-woo, you know, we don't know that, and we need to know that, because we have a mental health system, a global children's mental health system that is collapsing. And part of that reason is because children are constantly diagnosed and referred to these systems, not even for experiences such as I can hear a voice or I can see someone and you can't, for feeling unhappy, for a feeling of unhappiness or for suffering. So if we go back to your question about why is it important to research with children, we don't do that. And we need to be with children to learn about these experiences, to inform services that are meant to support children, but also in the wider context, maybe so we can learn more about consciousness, because that's a very adult-led field, and normally a very scientific or philosophical field, especially in the neurosciences when it comes to children. And again, children are missing from that area of research. So that's why we should research with them too.